Thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak with you today. Today, I'll focus on looking at and better understanding what systemic risks are all about. Um, as you see on the slide, there's a little blue dot on the right-hand side. If you would just indulge me for a moment, I want you to just take a look at where you're sitting right now. Take 5 seconds and try to find and count as many things that are the color blue. So look around you right now in your office, wherever you're sitting, and look for the color blue. You got 4 seconds, 3, 2, and 1. Excellent. Now just close your eyes for a moment and try to recount everything that you saw that was the color red. And again, the key message I want to bring from this one is that what we focus on shapes what we see. If we focus on blue, we're going to see blue and not see the red. If you're going to take anything away from this presentation, it's this phrase here: to do differently, we must think differently. And with that, I'll be introducing the whole notion about systems thinking and about perspective, just like the blue dot, how perspective is key in terms of how we understand the problem space, but how we design solutions in that as well. We've seen around the world in our own communities, different natural disasters, different shocks, extreme heat, extreme cold. We have wildfires, the virus, we have coronavirus, we have floods. All those and many more have actually stress tested the resilience of our societal systems. The COVID-19 pandemic was a really important shock to us, allowed us to reflect on it and better understand, when we focus on health actions in discrete and short-term perspectives, we actually lose sight of the potential consequences. And I guess another key message is that, we have intended outcomes, but there's always unintended outcomes that we have to better understand. Hence, the systems thinking approach is key. The WEF every year puts out their global risk landscape, and they do a beautiful job in terms of creating some visuals for us to better understand the complexity of risks that exist locally, regionally, and globally. When we take a look at these diagrams that WEF puts together, it's not what it is, but what it does for us, which is important. And just by looking at these diagrams, we start to seeing that, we can't just focus on one risks. They're all interdependent, interconnected. It allows us to understand the cascading effects of risks, but also allows us to reflect upon intervention strategies, looking for those leverage points by understanding the risk landscape. The COVID-19 is a perfect example of the requirement for paradigm shift. We focus on a narrow focus of the health side of the pandemic, but we have to understand that single risks, things are beyond just single risks. There's multi-hazards, multi-sector approaches to better understand the cascading effects of risks. So this paradigm shift allows us, it requires us to address the systemic nature of risks. Taleb, in his book on anti-fragility, he says something very profound. He says that not seeing the tsunami or an economic event coming is excusable. Building something fragile to them is not. And I think that's a powerful, for me, that's a call for action. We have to understand our risk landscape and make sure we're not building fragility into our systems. So we can really characterize a lot of the problems around the world as wicked problems. Humanity's facing these wicked problems of global climate change, the pandemic, systemic racism, economic inequality. So we have to understand how these wicked problems emerge, how they're created, how they're perpetuated, and what are the vulnerabilities that exist in our societal systems that continue to perpetuate these wicked problems. So when we think about global health ecosystem, we look at the natural hazards, the flooding, for example, and we really, again, from a systemic perspective, we really understand that things like climate change are actually exposing existing inequalities. Not everyone experiences disasters in the same way. Oftentimes, it's the vulnerable populations or the vulnerabilized populations that experience these disasters the worst. There's an inherent fragility in our global, for example, health ecosystems. There's cascading effects. And what we have to really understand is that we have to understand this fragility exists and there's an inherent interdependency across our societal systems. And having an understanding of that will allow us to better design resilient communities given the risk landscape. So we can really take a look at the world we live in, and it's termed we live in under conditions what are called VUCA. We live in conditions of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. And that really affects how we view the world, how we experience the world, and how we make decisions to deal with some of these risks. And really focuses, often governments have a lack of understanding of managing these VUCA conditions or understand these VUCA conditions and planning for uncertain futures and actually what we can actually do today to achieve desired outcomes. So anticipation becomes a key skill set, a key mindset for dealing with or living in this VUCA world. This last year, we actually published, I was part of a team that worked with the UNDRR and published a report on better understanding the cascading and systemic risks. So lessons learned from COVID-19. And the link is there. Take a look at it. It's a fabulous document that's put together. And again, one of the key messages from this presentation and from that report as well is to do differently, we must think differently. The OEC's General Secretary, he really captured it well, when he said that unless we adopt a systems approach, unless we employ systems thinking, we will fail to understand the world we live in. That's a call for action. That's a real powerful paradigm shift that's required. So we introduced this notion of systems thinking, and systems thinking really looking at the interrelationships, bringing different perspectives to the table rather than just focusing on blue, focus on the other colors as well, and understanding what boundaries we're creating by looking at it from a systems perspective. So when we look at the world around us, we look at major disasters, we have these events, again, in these iceberg model, which is a fabulous model. We look at these events that take place and we react to these events. But when systems thinking, we want to look below the surface of the water at the real content of the iceberg. So we look at the patterns. What patterns exist that are creating these events? So it forces us or invites us to actually anticipate. We look at the underlying structures that feed those patterns that, again, invites us to actually design resilient strategies. And even more important, the fundamental part is actually having the right mental models to transform our mental models to really address in advance what some of these major disasters would give rise to. So systemic risk in COVID-19, we look at COVID-19, we look at the health risks. But we also look again from the UNDR report that there was a ripple effect that emerged from the health effects that extended, and this is key in terms of systemic risks. It extended to the economic, the social, and the political domains. It just wasn't a health crisis. It was a global, multidimensional crisis as well. Here's a beautiful map that I found on the internet, and it shows sort of the first order effects of the COVID-19 and the second order and the third order. And I think that's important for us to recognize when we think about systems in terms of our decision making. When we make a decision, there's intended consequences and there's unintended consequences. So really systemic risks are really emerge from this interconnectivity, this interdependence that exists across our societal systems. It really focuses on elements of interdependence, interconnectedness, and cascading effects. We recognize that there's non-linear relationships. So a small effect, a small input can have a huge effect. There's feedback loops. There's tipping points in systemic risks. There are things that are being unnoticed. There's a resident uncertainty, and things are very dynamic when we're dealing with this sort of systemic risk that exists in our societal systems. Here's one of the maps that you'll find in the UNDR report. It really captures the whole notion of systemic risks and unintended consequences. And what this map, what this diagram actually shows, with the coronavirus at the center, there's a whole bunch of interdependent and interconnectivities everywhere from the effect on social protection, on food insecurity, on intimate partner violence. There's a whole bunch of things that are interdependent and interconnected to better understand what this risk landscape looks like. So just in final thoughts, when we think about some of these major crises that exist, like the COVID-19, we have to look at sort of that crisis management and really adjust ourselves to these transboundary and compound and uh, multi risks that exists and multi hazards that are risk. It's really about looking at risks and disasters that they're not really specific to certain sectors, but they transcend sectors, transcend geographical regions and periods of time as well. Really recognizing that there's cascading and ripple effects across society and societal systems from disasters and from our interventions in managing some of these disasters. Wyke and Sutcliffe in their book, they they have a beautiful quote. It's unexpected events often audit our resilience. That's powerful. Everything that was left unprepared becomes a complex problem. Every weakness comes rushing to the forefront. And this really forces us, or introduces us, invites us to recognize the existence of systemic risks, to better understand the interdependencies, and to better prepare ourselves and prepare and create a resilient strategy for our communities. Einstein said it beautifully when he said, the problems we have cannot be solved at the same level of thinking that created them. So really, the key message from this is that we have to do differently. We must think differently. Bringing a systems lens to the perspective allows us to understand the interdependencies, the interconnectivities, the boundaries, the cascading effects that risks have across societal systems. And probably more important is that our intervention strategies always have intended consequences, but we have to recognize the unintended consequences as well. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anthony.